I'm really pleased to welcome Gail Ollis. Gail Ollis is a researcher at Bournemouth University, and some of her work is on us, on software developers. So it's always very nice when someone takes an interest in you. And Gail's interested in the way software developers work, practice, and think about themselves and their work. Thanks, Gail.
Thank you and good morning. So, as this is Children's Day at Pycon, I wanted to start by telling you a story. So, once upon a time, I was a young software developer. It was a long time ago, in a land of waterfalls. In those days, it was decreed that any bid to a potential customer must include the magic words, waterfall model, just as it later became essential to claim that you're agile. It was a frustrating time. We spent endless hours writing lots of documents up front, but we didn't have a crystal ball. The documents were always overtaken by what we learned when it came to actually writing code. It was good that we didn't just dive in headlong, but it was almost impossible to go back upstream and correct the documents. They became useless and disposable, which was a shame. So way back then, I was asking my boss if we could please have a more iterative kind of process, one that didn't make an assumption we could all see was incorrect, the assumption that we could work out all the design up front and then just go and implement it. In reality, there's no just about implementation. Unless you're really not paying attention to what you're doing, implementation is a learning process. So, waterfall was just the beginning, and throughout a career rather longer than I'd like to think about, lots of things came and went. Or with that same critical eye, I was watching all the ideas that people came up with, right from the big scale of giant project management approaches and software methodologies, down to individual tools and processes and practices. Always looking for ways to do things better, but always keeping a beady eye on whether or not they really did deliver. So, does anyone remember RTSASD? No, deadly silence. SSADM? Yeah, a few. GDPM? Acronyms were really big when I started my career. I'm really pleased to say they don't seem quite so bad at least in the methodology area now. A tool called Teamwork. Anyone use that? Oh, you lucky people, not anyone. So lucky. So all these things have more or less gone, and completely gone in some cases. I think GDPM is still kind of hanging on in a slightly different form. So why have they gone? Were they oversold? I think they probably were oversold. I mean, I mentioned the Teamwork tool. There is money to be made out of selling a tool, right? So there's a lot to be had for the people selling it in promoting it and encouraging people to use it. And maybe we were expecting too much from it as well. We're looking for a solution, and someone's promising it. It's very tempting to go for that. Maybe, just when we got all these super-duper ideas, we did it wrong. Though I'd argue that if actually that's the case, then they're not a great super-duper idea, because human beings have to implement it. If it's not something that human beings can do easily, and we're going to do it wrong, then don't blame us for doing it. Redesign your tool, your process, whatever. And another reason some of these things are gone is just because they're obsolete. Technologies have moved on. That RTSASD, for example, reflects a rather different type of programming language than we now use. So some of them are obsolete. But I'd also argue in particular that we did have too much faith in them. So we're expecting too much. Software development isn't easy. So expecting magic simple answers for it is just simply naive. So with this kind of, it sounds like I became cynical, but I'm not. I was just questioning and keeping an eye on things, whether or not things really deliver. Sort of testing the results, if you like. So one time at a conference, I said, I don't believe in methodologies. And people went a bit, ooh. And I don't mean literally. I mean, obviously, I believe they exist. You know, there's plenty of evidence that they exist. But I don't believe in them in that sort of trusting this is going to be the answer to all our problems sort of way. But someone very much smarter than me suggested that they are useful as stories. They're a helpful way of imagining alternate worlds and how we might do things differently. So that's one of the things I'm going to talk about today, how you can look at them as a source. The other thing about stories is that stories can work as a reminder to examine things critically and assess what might be effective, and as a tool for thinking, to hone your analytical skills, if you like. So I'm going to talk about those things following a classic story structure. And why should the kids have all the fun, right? So, initially, in classic stories, there's a problem. It may be a dragon terrorising the land, I don't know, doing whatever dragons do, generally hoarding gold and burning things down and eating people, whatever. Or it might be a cursed princess, one who's been cursed by a, what do you call them, wicked fairy, asleep for 100 years, not going to wake up until the handsome prince comes along and gives her a kiss. Or it might be something rather more prosaic, like all our great ideas for improving how we do software development, not actually quite delivering on what we hope they might have. So there's your problem. Second stage in your classic story structure, protagonist rides into the rescue and tackles the problem. And finally, hopefully they all live happily ever after, but for the characters who don't live happily ever after, the ones who die at the hands of the dragon or something, maybe there's a moral to be drawn from them. So, Chapter 1, the problem. And if you remember nothing else today, remember this one. What problem are you trying to solve? Because if you don't understand the problem, how are you going to fix it? It's kind of like debugging. If you don't know what your problem is, what the underlying issue is, then how can you have any confidence in the fix? You may go in there and hack something together and say, oh, it must be this. But if you haven't really understood what's going on underneath, that thing is going to come back and bite you. So you really need to understand what the problem actually is that you're tackling there. So you need a tool that's a good fit to the job, a good fit to the problem you've actually got. Michael Jackson, not that one, the software one, puts it really nicely here. The power of a method is inversely proportional to its generality. So he talks about it in terms of powerful methods being ones that exploit the features of the problem quite closely. So they are a very close fit to it, which is great if that's actually your problem, but it does mean you need quite a repertoire of solutions, of methods to apply. And when I say method, this covers a whole range of things, from methodologies right down to little individual tools that you might choose. Some things you don't have the say-so over, but there are lots of small decisions and ways of doing things that you do have the choice over. So don't think I'm just talking about the things that the management decide you're going to do. So a powerful method is one that exploits the features of the problem quite closely, but you do need a repertoire of different ones. Conversely, if you've got a method that's very general, then you can apply it in more scenarios, but it's not quite such a good fit to them. So it's rather like that one-size-fits-all label on clothing. Yes, everyone can get it on, probably, but it's not actually a fit for anyone. It looks pretty terrible on most people. So, is a silver bullet the solution to your problem? We've had lots of silver bullets come along over the years, and believe me, none of them are going to work. But if your problem actually was a werewolf, then maybe a silver bullet would work. So if your problem's a ghost, probably not. I'm guessing a silver bullet's just going to go straight through. Vampire, I'm not sure. Do silver bullets work at all against vampires? Maybe slow them down a bit, possibly. But I believe the preferred solution with a vampire is a nice wooden stake. So you need to know which problem it is that you're trying to solve. Back to that same question, which problem are you trying to solve? Are you trying to solve ghost, werewolf, vampire, or some other monster that we haven't even come across yet? So you've got a generalization specialization problem here. If you've got to take a solution off the shelf, it risks either being too vague, somewhere up at the monster level where it doesn't really tell you what to do. I couldn't even think of I was trying to think of what you might use generically against a monster. All I could come up with was running away. I couldn't find a way of defeating it. If you think of one, you've probably got a good horror story writing career ahead of you. So if it's too general, it's just not going to work against these things. If it's too specific, if it's your silver bullet, it's going to work beautifully against the werewolf. Completely useless, I imagine, against the ghost, and probably only moderately helpful against the vampire. I'm not an expert on these creatures. I bow to your superior knowledge if you know better about this. So, I'm talking about things being too specific or too vague. To take an example, for my research participants, if any of you are here, thank you ever so much. Obviously couldn't have done it without you. I'm very grateful. So, a lot of my research participants said fewer lines of code are better. Now, they weren't saying this as a rule to hand over to, to hand on wisdom to other developers. They were just saying it as things that make their life harder. In my research at Bournemouth University, where I've been asking them about things that make life harder or easier for them. that other developers do. And so they said fewer lines of code are better, which, if I took it as guidance and put that out as Gail's great big book of good software practice, is completely useless because it's way too vague. And you really risk, if you tell people write fewer lines of code, that what they'll go and do is try and do everything in as little code as possible and end up with something horribly, horribly obfuscated. So you could write a bit more detail and you could start trying to legislate against that obfuscation and say, well, fewer lines of code, but not at the risk of obfuscating it, at which point you're going to have to go into horrendous length and detail. It all becomes far too prescriptive, and it's useless as guidance because it's too specific again. And you may well say, well, isn't it obvious that you shouldn't have too many lines of code? It's kind of if you phrase it that way, it's inherent in the too many. And yes, if only that were true, that it were obvious to everyone. But it is true to some, and the reason it's obvious to them isn't because someone's told them a simple rule, it's because they've understood the spirit of that and the intent of that idea. So, I think I've made it clear that I don't think off-the-shelf answers are ever going to give you a perfect answer to your specific problem, however respectable the answer. And I'm not suggesting that ideas out there aren't respectable. There's a lot of well-thought-out stuff, but you need to do some thinking too. So it says, one of my favourite lines, I think, from the Pragmatic Programmer, no method can replace thinking. So you can't just say, oh, well, this is a highly respected method, everyone's using it, let's use that and we'll be fine. You have to do the thinking for yourself. Because what you're looking at might be something that's too general to really get to grips with your problem and exploit those features fully. Or it might be something that's a bit too specific and isn't a good fit for exactly the problem you've got, and it needs a little tweaking. So however carefully you follow it, however respectable, however many people are writing about it in glowing terms, following it rigorously and taking a respectable process doesn't guarantee you success. What you need is some well-thought-out processes that are appropriate to your context, what you're actually doing. So, for example, the reason I've got a picture from the three little pigs here, this pig 1 who built his house of straw, and we have no reason to believe, I don't think any of the versions of this I've ever read, no reason to believe he didn't build it well in terms of a straw house. He's probably followed all the building regulations for straw house building. It's probably ticked quite a lot of eco boxes for its insulation qualities. It could be a very well-built straw house, built with planning permission and everything. But he's built it in a context where there's a big bad wolf roaming about. A big bad wolf with considerable huff and puff capability and a taste for pork. So, is that a sensible place to build a straw house? Probably not. Is there anything wrong with the straw house per se? Not necessarily. But in Three Little Pig Land, definitely not the place to build it. Okay, so that's all a bit whimsical. But if you take that to a real building and look at the kind of buildings that are built in earthquake zones or where there are hurricanes or where there are floods, the same sort of principle applies. So buildings that make perfect sense in Cardiff may not make sense in Bangladesh or Japan or wherever. So, okay, that's still buildings, right? That's still not software development. But then, again, lots of context variables in software development. For a start, just look at your team. Is it a distributed team? Is it an experienced team? An inexperienced team? Or just simply a brand new team? And that's just teams. There are so many other variables. The technology that you're using, the customer you've got, the company culture, all these things are having a bearing on how things work when you try to do them. So you need to take those into account. So, on to chapter 2. We've recognised the problem. We know what problem you're trying to solve. Now, having identified the problem, protagonist rides into the rescue, trying to address the problem. Now, the fairy tale solution to that one is simply hire the best people. Now, it has the merit that it works. Coburn here puts it on quite nicely. Purely people factors he puts it better than I do, predict project trajectories quite well, overriding choice of process or technology. So this is in a book on agile software development, right? And they're trying out various things and finding actually whatever you do, good people actually get it done, which is also something that my research participants said a lot. You know, it hardly matters how you're doing it. If you've got good people doing it, they'll make it work. And we're problem solvers, right? That's what we do. So you give us a job to do, you give good people a job to do, they get on and do it. And even despite the process in many cases. Just don't get me started on gamification, whole different talk. But, yeah, I mean, so it works as a solution, but it's just not a practical one. It is a fairy tale one. And just mathematically, we can't all be above average. We can't all work in an above average team. It's just not going to happen. And even if you could, what's best anyway? That's going to depend on the context, for a start, the job that you're doing. How do you know what best is? And for example, people talk a lot about rock star programmers. Could you have a team of rock star programmers? I'm not sure. Actually, I am sure, but I'm not going to say it here. Right. So, this hire the best people for the job approach reflected quite a lot in the fairy tale recruitment of suitors. So we've got a chap here riding up to the castle. King is looking for someone to marry his daughter, but he's terribly fussy about it, which is fair enough. And wants somebody who can do an impossible task, which is setting the bar kind of high, but it's a popular theme in fairy tales, which is all very well and good. You get a problem solver, actually, at the end of it, somebody who works around it or finds some cunning solution to it. It's very rarely by actually being able to do something impossible. But the drawback with this approach is that some really good people get rejected along the way, which in fairy tale cases may mean eaten by dragons, which is a bit drastic. But actually some really good people get eaten by dragons in the software recruitment process as well. Because there are some dragon interviewers out there who really like to ask just fiendish questions that have no resemblance at all to what the person's going to be doing on a day-to-day basis. I'm pretty sure some of them are just showing off. I do know for sure also that some of them are trying to ask questions where people ought to say, I don't know. They might know, but if they don't know, how do they respond if they don't know the answer? Because that's pretty important. But either way, it's not a very unpleasant experience for the interviewee. And in any case, if you're looking for the best people, you have to understand that we're not all the best for every project we work on. You must all be on things where one project goes better than another. A team pulls together better than another. The job you're doing is more interesting. All sorts of things affect how well a project goes. So things are never perfect all of the time. So is this a counsel of despair? Well, no. If I'd given up that much, I wouldn't be standing here talking about it. So I'm not saying, oh, we wouldn't start from here. What I am saying, though, is how do we get there from here? So 3 important words in that, we. So how do we get there? That involves understanding your context, what people are you working with, what situation are you in, what's your company like, what customers are you working from, all the people involved, they're all involved in that we. So how do we get there? You need to know where you're going, your project goal, and what solved is going to look like when you arrive there. And from here, that's the what problem are you trying to solve. So you've got a problem, that's where we are now, that's here. You're trying to get somewhere, it being better than that. You need to be a bit clearer about what better means, and just like what best means. And who you are, what context you're solving that in. And as part of that, as part of looking at the we and the here, you need to be honest about the process you've currently got and debug that just like you would a bit of software. Because there's a distinct possibility that whatever your documented procedure, it's not necessarily being followed 100% to the letter. Because there'll be things that don't quite work. And we're problem solvers, and we'll work around it. So you need to look closely at that and be honest about what's actually happening so that you can fix it. It's that same debugging scenario again. If you're not looking at it closely enough to find out what the underlying problem is, you're not going to solve it. So you need to know what all the issues are there and understand what problem you're trying to solve. So I mentioned earlier on that I don't believe in methodologies. I also don't believe in Santa. And yet, every Christmas, millions of presents delivered to happy and overexcited children across the world. So it may not be strictly true in the literal sense, but it works really well as a successful template for delivering presents to lots of happy and probably very overexcited and very tired children. So the details of that, how that story works, don't matter too much. There's flying reindeer, but we don't actually need real flying reindeer landing on your roof and causing a clatter. I suspect it would be terrifying, actually, to hear the clatter of hooves on your roof. But what we do have is a few animatronic ones scattered around shopping centres and a few live ones hanging around at Santa's grottos, just to just to create the spirit of the thing nicely without actually having to worry about that tricky detail of getting them to fly. Similarly, chimneys. So the classic story with Santa is he comes down the chimney with the presents, which is, given the size of the sack of presents, looks like a bit of a feat in itself. But not every house has chimneys. And even if they do, I don't believe for a moment, when I was growing up and Santa was delivering presents to me, we had a chimney. And I don't believe for a moment that my dad ever climbed down that to deliver presents. I do kind of believe that Santa was my dad, actually. Sorry, the children all gone. You did say to be careful about what I said. So chimneys. The solution these days for houses that haven't got one, and lots of people now haven't got a chimney, is not that you have to say, oh dear, you can't have presents because Santa can't come down the chimney, but a magic key. You can get a magic key, you leave it outside for Santa, he picks it up, lets himself in when he comes around, and all sorted. And you don't have to worry about anybody else using it and getting in, because Santa's magic, right? So he's the only one who can use it. So there's an adaptation to the mechanism. We're not following the script to the letter. There's not some big fat bloke in a robe dropping down a chimney that you haven't got. Just a little, the spirit of the story is still there, but the mechanism is adapted to fit what's possible and appropriate in the local context. So if you find yourself standing on your roof, wearing a big red robe and maybe a fake beard, and dropping presents down the chimney on Christmas Eve, you really do have to ask yourself, why am I doing this? There are safer, simpler ways of achieving that outcome. So the same is true, though rather less picturesque, of when you're doing anything as part of a process, a practice, at whatever level you're doing that. So if you're producing an artifact, following some procedure, taking a particular step, maybe even setting endless configuration items that you're not really interested in, you have to ask yourself, why are you doing this? And if it's because the process says so, or because the framework demands it, and not because you can see it achieving something towards your goal, that's not really enough. You're risking missing better ways of doing it and getting to the same outcome at less risk. You're also risking getting just not good bang for your buck because it's not really achieving what you're setting out to achieve, but tail wagging the dog somewhat. So, understanding why you're doing something demands that you're paying attention closely to what you do. So retrospection is good, no problem with that, but it's not quite enough. So what I'm going to ask you to try to be is spective. So think first and look before you leap. And by all means, retrospect afterwards and see how it went. But before you do it, think about it first. So when you've got a job to do, ask yourself, I've got this job to do, what can I use? Not, I've got this cool tool, can I shoehorn it into the project? Think about the project goals, what you're actually trying to achieve with it. So, bit of bitter experience here, not doing the writing or creating an artifact because that's what the process says. I did actually once ask, okay, so what's this for? I can't remember what it was. I think it was probably a document. What's it for? Trying to understand what it's needed for so I could make it serve that purpose. And the answer was, it's the process. That's just not a good enough answer. Nor is it a good enough answer to be using a new framework because it's interesting, for example. So by all means, go out and look at these things and discover what's out there, but it doesn't necessarily mean you immediately have to rush in and use it. So you've got to be honest with yourself with that, about your rationale, and that's not necessarily easy to do. It's not necessarily a conscious rationale. You're not sat there thinking, oh, this is really interesting, I'll use it, necessarily. So it would be nice to have a bit of help with that, but it's going to have to be a conscious step that you deliberately do of, okay, why am I doing this? To slow down and stop and ask that question. So, yes, magic mirrors, like this one, notorious for telling the truth. It would be really nice if we could all have one of those. Then you could ask it, mirror, mirror on the wall, am I doing this because it's cool? Let's face it, it's fun, but it's not going to have reason. So, it's not just yourself you need to question, though. You also need to ask the hard questions of other people when there's a lot of momentum going along of this is the great thing we must do, this is the solution. So here's another story to illustrate that. The Emperor's New Clothes. A bunch of con artists tell the king that they're going to make him a suit of clothes so fine, so wonderful, that stupid and incompetent people can't see it. And of course, everyone says how absolutely marvellous this thing looks. And the king's so chuffed with all this that he goes and parades through the streets in it. And it takes a child to ask the question, why is the king wearing no clothes? And when there's a lot of momentum behind an idea, for whatever reason, it can be quite hard to challenge it. I mean, not just for fear of looking stupid, as it was carefully set up by the con artists in this case, but also because it's hard to do that when there's other people so tight, so pushing so hard behind it. But you do need to know, back to that what problem are you trying to solve thing, what problem are you trying to solve with this? And then this idea that you're considering, how will this solve it? And how will you know? What will it look like when it's solved? You need to understand what solved is to be able to evaluate whether or not this thing could give you a solution. So you need to, it requires some independent thought there and stepping back from what's going on and not getting dragged along with the majority. So, because groupthink and conformity have led to quite a lot of bad decisions over the years. I don't want to go into it here, but if you Google groupthink and Bay of Pigs, you'll find a very scary example. So challenge what's going on, but challenge it nicely. What Daniele was saying earlier reminded me of a friend who's just started learning Python. Hooray! Quite how it's like taking him so long, I've no idea. But he started learning Python. And he announced this in his office. And he was greeted with Python's rubbish, which is clearly not true, but it's also not even it's not a sensible evaluation. You know, so they may well have questions about its suitability to do the kind of things he might be thinking of doing with it. But that requires a sensible discussion, not a shouting it down. So, like I said, challenging a majority can be hard. And that's something that psychology's been interested in for a long time. I'd like to show you a video of an experiment that was first done in 1951. I apologise for the scale of it. Clearly my tech foo is evaporating rapidly since I've become a researcher. But nonetheless, it's an interesting experiment, I think. If I can get it to work. It's better if you can hear it, though. I'm going to fix my audio. Oh. Yep.
So should something coming out now?
Yep.
Okay. We should have audio now. So that's in there.
Oh. Sorry? I didn't change it after yesterday, so...
Yesterday, it might not have kept the setting.
Oh, right. How did you change it?
Right.
Clemens.
Where's the cursor gone? There it is. Yeah, it's coming out of the HDMI, that's why.
Oh, right. Thank you.
Just
3.
Yes. Right. Okay. This is what comes of ceasing to be a developer and going off and doing research. Sorry. Right. Try again.
The Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you...
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1. 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3. 3.
3.
You have to feel for the poor guy, don't you? So in this experiment, in the original version of it, 74% of people said, of the participants in this, at least once went along with the wrong answer that the Stooges were giving. And on average, a third of the time, people would go along. And they were asked afterwards to give explanations for why they'd gone along with it. And some did say that they didn't want to stand out. But others actually questioned their own judgment. If all these people are saying that, is there something I'm not seeing? And if that can happen in an example like this, where actually the answer's clear-cut and there is a right answer, how much harder is it when you've got a situation where you're trying to choose between other different possibilities, and there's not a right answer, there are possibilities about the way you could do it, and you've got to choose between them, but you've got reasons to think the solution that's being offered to you is not the right one. But it's not a black and white yes or no question. And sometimes it's actually hard to even be allowed the chance to think when there's so much noise going on about the sort of a particular solution. Much like if you're trying to help someone with debugging something, they've got a pet theory about it must be the such and such. It's very hard to actually get a look in to properly analyse the problem and think about what you're doing. So, one final story to help you think about how to question and have an analytical approach. Well, it's something you're good at anyway, right? I mean, developers. But I need another story. So, this one, Rumpelstiltskin. So, in short, a father with a daughter makes some outrageous claims about her ability to spin straw into gold, which is a bit out of order, frankly. But and the king gets to hear of this, and the king promptly locks the daughter up in a tower with a spinning wheel and a load of straw and says, "Go on then, get on with it, or I'll kill you," which is also not very nice behaviour for a king. And girl sits and cries, as you would, because it's a pretty impossible situation. And then an imp turns up and does it for her, but at a terrible price. He wants her firstborn child. So she clearly pulls herself back together to some degree, because she negotiates here, and somehow manages to negotiate that if she can figure out the imp's name, then she'll be let off that deal. So the imp goes scampering off into the forest and crows to himself about how brilliant this is, because he's going to win, because she's never going to figure out that his name is Rumpelstiltskin, and gets overheard and therefore loses. So, 2 morals I'd like to draw from this story. The first moral is names. Don't get hung up on what it's called. If you really examine this story closely, is that really the bit you're most interested in, what this imp is actually called? There's so many bigger issues in there that you need to worry about, like the atrocious behaviour of the father, the behaviour of the king. Kings don't seem to come out terribly well in fairy tales, generally, actually. And this opportunistic imp taking advantage of this poor girl's situation. Really, what he's actually called, I mean, the fact that she doesn't know what his name is might matter, but what you actually call it really doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter if what you're doing is pure whatever. I don't want to diss any particular processes, so if it's not pure, I don't know, Ollisology, it doesn't matter. What's the correct solution is one that you've chosen thoughtfully to fit the problem that you've got and the context that you're in. It doesn't have to be a fashionable name. Buzzwords are not the thing that gets good software written. And the second moral for this story is keep an eye open for the magic. Because for goodness sake, woman, what is his game? It's clearly too good to be true that he's turning up and spinning straw into gold for you. So when you're looking at what people are promising, look out for the miracle happens here stage. Look out for the hidden magic. It's very rarely made explicit, so you have to look quite closely and be analytical about how it's going to happen. So for example, that RTSD that I talked about, it was an analysis and design approach where you drew lots of diagrams with lots of circles on them joined up by arrows, and all looks very pretty. And it was a hierarchical thing where if you dove down through one of the circles, it would take you to another very similar diagram. And then at some point we had to take this and write some Ada with it. And there was just no clear way to map that. in training courses for it. A good company who did send us off on training, nice noddy examples, and it's pretty obvious what the code would look like when you've actually got a whole stack of hierarchical diagrams that you're trying to translate into some ADA. Altogether less obvious what you should do. Look out also for those noddy examples if you're being offered something. Is it something that will scale? Also look out for sleight of hand. Another thing I went on training for was this GDPM project management thing, where we all had to do an exercise in the morning, building little Lego things, and then in the afternoon we did it again. Now, it's actually quite a good process. I don't have any problems with it really. There's some good ideas in there. But you have to admit that if we'd gone and done that same process again in the afternoon with no training at all and applying no new ideas, we'd have done better because we'd have learnt stuff from that exercise in the morning. But oh no, they wanted to tip the balance in their favour a bit. So suddenly, magically, in the afternoon, rather than having to buy individual Lego bricks, our teams could go out and buy little sub-assemblies, and everything was so much quicker and easier. And this is all because we were applying a new method? No. So be careful, be interested, be open to the possibilities of something new, don't be cynical about it, but also be healthily sceptical. So finally, chapter 3, they all live happily ever after? So you've analysed your problem, you've understood the context that you're working in, you've thoughtfully chosen your solution, but software development isn't easy. Things change, new projects come along, new ideas, new technologies. And after all this change, all this new exciting stuff is what makes it interesting. So expecting one solution that just fixes it and done, not going to happen. There's no ever after in it. So if by happily you mean that you think your problem is indeed a werewolf, and you think you've found the silver bullet, then that is a fantasy. If you think what I was saying was do whatever you like, no, that's not what I meant. That would be a horror story. You need a good reason for what you're doing, a good clear narrative. It needs to be well thought out. It doesn't necessarily need to be a shiny one with a fancy name, but you need to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, not least so that you can repeat it, or if it doesn't work out too well, make sure you don't repeat it. So, rather than happily ever after, moral of my story is this: it's not about a happy ending so much as a happier ongoing process. So finding your way to tackling software development better will be happier if your approach, to paraphrase Goldilocks, is neither too cynical nor too credulous, but just right. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, Gail. Do we have any questions? We've got a microphone there, and I don't know if we have a microphone over there. Yes, please stand up if you could just make your way to the microphone so everyone can hear you if you have any questions. Queue up at the microphone.
In Python, we have the Zen of Python, and I wondered if you had any comments about the Zen of Python. That's how, a lot of the people think about Python and new additions to Python and how they program in Python.
I think it's important to be aware of the possibilities that are out there and keep understanding what's coming along. But not to rush in necessarily and immediately get carried away with it and use it. So if none of us went out and looked at all the possibilities that came along, we wouldn't even be writing in Python, would we? So you need to be alert to them, but not necessarily, but judicious about choosing when to do them and introducing the rest of your team to them. Does that answer your question? No? Recap for me.
Hello, Gail. I hope this question isn't too difficult. It's this: how does a group of people working together develop more trust and confidence between them?
Well, come to my workshop tomorrow afternoon. So the work I've been doing in asking people what makes things easier or harder for them among their colleagues is something I'm now trying to apply by using some of the techniques I used in the interviews. And it's not a solution. I don't believe in easy solutions. Otherwise, I'd be out. If I did, or if I could be convincing about believing in it, I'd be out flogging one. But I'm not. But I do think if you can make people more aware of the impact, there's a bit, and facilitate that discussion. There's some scope there. So it's not about having a go and shouting people down. It's about helping people realise that there is an issue there in the way we interact with others.
Thanks very much, Gail. I've never met such a bunch of true believers as I have amongst people in software development. And
so a bunch of
true believers. Why are software developers, why are programmers such true believers in things? And is it inherent in what we're doing that makes people believers, fervent believers in this way?
I don't know. I think our enthusiasm kind of works against us sometimes a bit, doesn't it? I mean, but it's one of those tensions, because if you've not got that enthusiasm for new stuff and interesting stuff, you wouldn't be doing it. And that enthusiasm drives us forwards and develops wonderful new languages, and then we dig ourselves into a hole and get stuck with things because we build bigger and bigger systems and need solutions for that. But then we go find them. Being a creative problem solvers is sort of a double-edged sword in some ways.
We have time for one last question. If anyone's got one, yes, please.
So it seems to me that the industry's quite obsessed really with process, and I thought your slide where you said that successful teams are successful because of the teams, and yet we try and take the sort of practices that successful teams are using and apply them to other teams with the expectation that that will make things better. Do you think that there's really any evidence that methodology can improve things in teams that aren't succeeding?
Well, it's not a software development case, but there's an interesting thing that people did a while back with expert pilots about sort of procedures for landing, I think it was. And they got them to write a checklist of what they do. And taking that checklist and giving it to less experienced pilots worked well for the less experienced pilots. It improved their performance. But actually, if you ask the experts to follow that checklist, they did less well. So it's kind of, I think you can distill some of the things that are working, but you need to understand the context. You need to keep paying attention. That's the thing. I think yes, you can get. There's useful stuff in there because I'm not dissing the process. Actually, there's quite a lot of well thought out stuff in there. But what I have doubts about.
Are you saying then that by sort of taking other people's practices, that's really a way for us less experienced people to learn from people who are more experienced? It's not really the practice, but the knowledge that we benefit from.
I think you can draw on it, but you can't fetishize it as a solution. So you've got to take it and look at it and say, how could this help us? Which demands a certain amount of expertise in itself. I know it's kind of, if you're not the expert, how do you know it's working? But keep paying attention. Think about how it might work for you and keep an eye on whether or not it did. So this is, so the stories are useful. It's, but treat them as a story rather than a script.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Let's thank Gail one more time for that.